Hi all, and welcome to your wetlands instruction. Hopefully you took a look at the video that I put up last week, and so you have a generalized understanding of the fact that there are three wetlands: marshes, bogs, and swamps. And we're going to take a little bit of a look first at what wetlands are in general, how they are in the United States, and then we'll move on to a secondary recording which will delve into swamps, bogs, and marshes independently. So what is a wetland? Wetlands are areas where the soil, the plants, and the animals are all adapted to living in wet environments. One of the biggest things about wetlands is that the water table dictates whether or not a wetland will actually show water above the surface or not show water above the surface. So if you look at the photograph over here, this is a typical salt marsh. You can see that there's water here. But if I had come back in a few hours when the tide was out, you actually wouldn't see any water above the sandy surface of this particular marsh. So sometimes the water moves in and out via tides, and then sometimes it's just that the area is not getting enough precipitation and runoff for the water table to be above the surface. This happens in Pennsylvania all the time. So here are some photographs of wetlands. All of them currently have water in them, but hopefully you'll be able to imagine how some of them at another time of day or another time of year wouldn't necessarily have water. This is a delta, and marshes very often form at the mouths of deltas. These are some of the most productive, some of the most nutrient-rich wetlands in the world. This is also a marsh. You can see that because of the grasses. This is a tidal marsh. Up here, we have a bog. There are many bogs in the northern parts of the world. You can see from the background that this is probably a taiga. This is actually the Canadian taiga. You can see my friend the moose there, and he's wading through this particular bog. Down here, this is a swamp. Typical Pennsylvania swamp. I bet you could imagine that if you were walking through the woods and it was winter, all of this might be gone, because we know that winter tends to be a drier time in Pennsylvania, and so you might be able to walk all across this, no water at all. You come in summer, when we also don't get a lot of rain, water table would be low. All of this, you could walk right across it. You come in spring and fall, when this photograph was taken, you can see that there's water above the water table, thus it's actually present on the surface. Again, are wetlands wet all the time? Yes. Is water at the surface all the time? No, not in all wetlands. It's seasonal in some, it's there year-round in others. Here's a picture. Unfortunately, these aren't mine. I've been working on getting an area where I can take my own pictures, but I just haven't had 4 consecutive years where I've been able to take a photograph at the same location, so thank you, Google. Over here you can see this is October 2014, lots of surface water. Over here, August of 2014, also a fair amount of surface water, but less. You can see the grass poking through. September, obviously very dry year, no visible water on the surface. It's still a wetland though. If you walked across this picture, you would feel that spongy squishiness because the water is still waterlogging the soil. All of these plants have to be adapted to live in water all year round. Even if it's not at the surface, that ground is still going to be very spongy and very wet. And then over here you can see fall. And in the fall, you can also see that, that there's just a little bit of water covering over this grassy area. But again, wetland, 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 whether or not there is actual surface water. Plants need to be really specially adapted to living in wetlands because their roots are going to be wet. Their leaves may be wet all the time. At the top here, you can see the lily pad. They have their leaves sit in the water and they don't rot. They have very specially adapted ways to be able to pull in carbon dioxide and push out the waste product oxygen. and also to keep all of this root structure from not literally dissolving in the water. Here's a picture, if you can imagine kind of looking at a cross section of a wetland. Now, maybe it's a little floating island wetland, or maybe you could pretend that maybe this goes out onto more dirt. But what we really just want to be looking at is what's going on in these root systems that allows it to either A, be in saturated soil, or B, be literally hanging down into the water and still being able to take in that carbon dioxide and get rid of that waste oxygen product. You can see how they have these microbes. They have a biofilm. All of these things make it possible for them to be able to do this transfer and to exist in the water with this barrier that doesn't prevent the oxygen carbon dioxide transfer, but does prevent the water from dissolving the root structure. Now, some plants take a different tact. You can see this one here. I wish that I could have taken a photograph all the way from this picture all the way down to the bottom, because this tree is actually sitting in about 3.5 feet of water. This is actually in the Florida Everglades, but this one escapes the water by rooting, literally rooting on the side of the tree. Now, it's not a parasite. It doesn't actually take any nutrients from the tree. It just gets water when it rains, and it gets other nutrients that it needs as the wind blows. I'm sorry that I don't have a more updated wetland map than this of the entire United States. The bottom line on wetlands is they're just disappearing everywhere. There are actually some states that have 0% of their original wetlands left in them. And very few states, if any, to this time period have actually increased the amount of wetlands that they have. Some states are doing a better job on holding their wetland losses steady. Thus, there have been losses, but they don't continue to change over those wetlands. What happens to a lot of wetlands is two things. Number one, the ones along the coast are often developed on, and then all the ones in the middle of the United States, typically they end up getting backfilled so that farmers can farm on them. Luckily, in the 80s and 90s, we came to the understanding that wetlands were actually very good for farm fields, and so that stopped a lot of the backfilling. Some researchers got a few farmers to unfill some of their wetlands and to let them go back to a natural state. And those farmers had great success with their crops in future years that were dry. And so as word of mouth passed, a lot of this stuff here in the middle, a lot of these states, the farmers have stopped backfilling their wetlands voluntarily because they found that it helps to keep the crops alive year round. Here's just a little understanding of how much wetland there was out there, more updated 2002. You can see that there are some areas, the Pacific, very, very little wetland. The mountains, very, very little wetland. But then you get some places where there is a lot of wetland, which should make sense. Down here in the Southeast, think about what Florida's like. The Delta states, think about all of this area in here that is getting created and then disappearing and getting created and disappearing along the coastline. Wetlands are incredibly important for both land animals and water animals. Some animals go there to raise their young. Some animals actually lay their eggs in wetlands. One of the reasons that they do this is, again, remember, a lot of these wetlands are seasonal. So wetlands oftentimes won't have established fish populations because they can't live there. So when this frog or toad lays its eggs, there's potentially not going to be fish in that water to eat those eggs, so they have a better chance of surviving. Or here, this is a rock or a piece of wood, now I can't remember, and an insect or some other arthropod has come and laid its eggs here. When these eggs hatch, the young will drop directly into the water. And so this is a way for them to be kept safe away from predators, but then to have the area where they need to do their growing up. Wetlands are also incredibly important because they protect areas from storm surges. So places like Louisiana and Florida, if they get rid of those wetlands along the coast, any town or city that is just inland from that has a really high chance of getting massive storm damage. there's a simulation right here. If you'd like to watch it, you can click on the PowerPoint that's online and you can watch that simulation. Wetland share. They're actually amazing sharers. Because of infiltration, water will actually move through the ground from one wetland to another. And so they'll actually help to keep water from running off and flooding and picking up toxins. They'll actually hold on to that water and they'll actually push it through underground channels to fill other wetlands that are dry before allowing that water to potentially flood and do damage to either crops or homes. I wish that you could ask your neighbor what you learned, so I'll just give you a moment to read this slide and think about it. And imagine, you can tell your dog or your mom or dad, brother, sister. Wetlands are also amazing with pollution. And they take in pollution, they hold on to it, they keep it from going out into the greater environment, they slowly break it down. And so the area that is around wetlands tends to have a lower pollution rate. And where that water is infiltrating into larger bodies of surface water, that surface water tends to be cleaner because the pollution has been held by the wetland. Recreation. This is another really big way that wetlands are being saved. Fishing, boating, bird watching, these are enormous industries, billion-dollar industries in the United States. So some areas have held on to wetlands so that people can come and do all of these things and then spend money, Airbnb, go out to dinner, all of that stuff in the town that has preserved their wetlands. There are 3 types. Nationally, bogs, swamps, and marshes. The way that we have those in Pennsylvania, scrub shrub, forested, and emergent. Go to the next video to see information on those 3 types.